And that's it. And that's here we go. Isn't that wonderful? So, are we picking each other up too badly audio wise? Am I echoing from over there?
I'm not
You
hearing
said that on
any
my
Over
end.
echoes.
here.
Oh, hi. You're both in the same space.
Yes.
I
Um,
forget that that's a thing.
yeah, right.
I interact with people way too much online.
Um, okay, so Melinda is driving back to Panama City from Lakeland, which I understand to be a considerable trek. I asked if we should wait, or she'll be getting home soon-ish, or we can record if not. She didn't respond because she's driving. So we're recording, and she can chime in if and when she feels so compelled. Um, Let me get my copy. How are we doing though? How are we feeling? How are we what's popping?
And how's y'all's week?
Time isn't real. When was last week? It was good regardless. It's been good. We're I'm sorry.
I had a good week last week. I was up in Connecticut visiting my brother and my new niece, which was lovely. And now I am home, which is also lovely in its own way because I like sleeping in my own bed. But it was a good trip. I enjoyed myself.
Yay.
Connecticut sounds cold.
Connecticut is fairly cold. It's not, I mean, it's only marginally colder than New Jersey, and sometimes it's warmer, but
I was up there. I was up well no, because I told you because I asked you for suggestions on the pork roll and I got
yes.
it.
Where were you when you had the pork roll, by
I
the way?
was in in
Were you in New Jersey?
Hell. Yes, yes, I was in New Jersey. I was
Okay.
in Hell. I was in so New York and Mexico are two places that I have never been to, but I have seen, been close enough to see without being in, and that's where I was. I was like, those buildings are in the big old city.
Okay. I at least understand the general area you're in, and that's a good area to have pork roll.
Good. It's not
I
an
had a
area to
pork roll
be.
this morning.
Did you really?
Yeah, I did. I had pork rolls this morning for
I love
breakfast.
it.
I love that stuff, and
I didn't know what
honestly,
it
I make
was.
some of the best pork roll.
I didn't
It
know what the hell
is
it was.
good food.
But
It's
no, it
so
was
bad
good.
for you, so much saturated fat, but
No,
sometimes your
I'm
body is a temple, sometimes it isn't.
um
So bad that it's so good.
right here we are. Okay. What did we think? How did we feel? Right?
A lot of feelings.
I have a lot of thoughts, and so I don't want to go first because there's a lot of thoughts.
Okay.
It was slow starting up, but it started to hook me towards the end.
Okay.
I'm just really excited to pick up a piece of media that I like have no idea about. I've been doing this lately where I just dive into something head first without researching it ahead of time, and I'm obsessed with it. I'm like so happy. I also haven't read any fiction in like 8 years or something absurd. So
Yeah,
I'm
no,
so
I'm
excited.
I'm kind of in a similar boat. This was actually the second book that I read after not reading for a similarly embarrassingly long time. I think I don't think not before this book, but before the book I read before this book, I don't think I had finished a book that I wasn't assigned since like early high school, and it hurt my soul. And so I'm happy to be back to doing these things. All right, so you said that you have lots of thoughts. Nobody else seems to have much at all, so it's you're
So
on
many
deck.
thoughts.
You're on deck.
Um, so first off, I did enjoy this in many ways. Mostly from a structural standpoint, like I am somewhat admiring what it's doing, but I do have my own issues. So I didn't put these thoughts in any kind of rational order, so it's going to read less like an outline and more like somebody just throwing a newspaper at you.
That's what we're doing.
But I guess for myself, like I read Tigana last week. Like I started a book when I was in Connecticut and I finished it.
Okay.
And that's the kind of reading that I've been doing lately, where I'm reading like a book in a week. If it takes 2 weeks, then that's a long time for me. And this is kind of weird because like I'm usually the type of person who will just sit down for like a day straight and read, and not being able to do that was somewhat frustrating. I did like, I can tell what it was trying to do, and I admire it for what it's attempting to do.
Okay, that's a little passive aggressive. Please continue.
No, and like I don't mean that as
Oh, I
as
see what
much
it's
of an
going
insult
for,
as what
though.
it's
Like,
doing. So it sounds a lot worse than it actually is, because I admire a lot of books for what they attempt to do, and they end up being incredible books that sell tons and tons of copies and end up with New York Times and all that shit. My biggest problem, and it was only solved towards the very end at like page 40, was it didn't have progress. And by
okay.
progress, I don't mean that like, oh, because yes, you could turn pages and that's a thing, but that it really didn't have any signposts for the kind of progress that you're looking for. With like a romance novel, it
Right.
has the progress of, okay, these two should be getting closer together or at least interacting some way. A war novel, it should be getting closer to the final battle. Detective novel, closer to solving the mystery. And I think part of the problem was just having the multiple strands going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would like to note actually some definitions, because this is the kind of person I am.
Okay.
So there's a term called exegesis, and y'all might be familiar with that one.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's eisegesis. And exegetical interpretation is when you are reading something with the idea of, I'm trying to read this and understand it in the way that the author wrote it. So you're actually looking at it and saying, well, what did they mean? What was their experience and what were they trying to communicate? Where eisegesis is kind of what Johnny's doing, where he's looking at it and he's only taking what he wants
Yeah.
and leaving the rest behind, and is like, I don't really care. Like I'm just looking for what I'm looking for. And both are fine ways of interpreting things. The problem only exists when somebody who does eisegetical interpretation decides that they're speaking for a piece of literature when they present it as exegetical.
Do you think that that's happening? Do you
Uh,
think that Johnny is doing that?
no, not
Okay.
at all.
Okay.
I think that there's the possibility that Zampano is, but that is its own bag
Right.
of worms, because there's a couple of possibilities that I see here. And some of them have to do with actually the validity of who these people are. Because starting with Navidson, so we're starting at the very inner edges of this, we have a couple of possibilities. That real person, this really happened to them, and they filmed something about it, and Zampano saw it. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that somebody created Navidson. Was it to just write a book? Was it to sell something? Was it an intellectual experiment? There's also the possibility that Navidson is someone or something that exists outside of the typical rules of our reality, which seems to be what it's selling at times, but it's more so leaning towards real person. And the text seems, in my opinion, you could tell me that I'm wrong, and if you have textual evidence, I will be like, yes, cool. But it seems to me that the book is trying to tell us, using like the internal logic of this universe, because yes, we know that all of these things are made up. But it's trying to indicate that no, Navidson was real, or at least Zampano thinks that he was real.
I can buy that.
And so if he was real, then why did all of this stuff about him disappear? And that's a good question.
It is. So to go back to your issues with pacing and progress and story beats, I think Danielski is kind of working against himself here because within the logic of the world and of the text, Zampano is sort of talking and writing about this film kind of with the assumption that you've already seen it. It's a
Yes,
cultural
to some extent.
touchstone. Yeah, the Navidson record, we've all seen it. Like, um, and so Danielski kind of has to spoon feed you as much of the progress and the plot and the beats of the story of the film as he can within the framework of Zampano, assuming that he doesn't need to do that.
Yeah.
And there was a footnote. I've 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 begun to write in this book. I've never like marked up a book before, and this has felt bad, but I'm doing it. Um, so there was a footnote that, and I'm sorry, I'm not structured at all either. So,
That's A-okay.
um, so there's a footnote where I think it was the editors say like, hey, if you think that it's weird that Zampano is taking all this much time to give you the narrative of what's happening when this is supposed to be like a critical analysis type of piece, uh, we addressed that in footnote blah 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 in chapter so and so later on.
Yeah.
Um, okay, thank you. I don't know if any of you actually skipped to read that footnote or if you were just like, I'll get to that when it comes. Um, and I don't mind saying it's not super spoilery or whatever. That what footnote does that refer forward to?
Page 5, footnote 67. I didn't realize I was muted.
Page
The
what?
chapter 5, footnote 67. The footnote you're referring to is on page 9.
Oh. Okay, hang on. I'm sorry. Chapter 567. So basically, this is a note of Johnny's talking about how he tracked down one of the readers that was reading to Zampano before he died, and how she was a PhD candidate in comp lit who apparently always objected to the large chunks of narratives that Zampano kept asking her to write down, and was like, "Hey, you don't need to do this. This is bad form. If you were in my class, I would mark you down for it. You're writing like a freshman," were kind of her words. And he kind of he made a similar comments one that we did get to about like, I never finished high school, but good, that means I'm smarter than you. He was like, we always look for doctors, but sometimes we are lucky to find a frosh. And just saying how like his writing style he acknowledges to be immature, but he sees a value in that, and so that's kind of an excuse that Danielski comes up with to sort of allow himself to give you more narrative than you would have to if Zampano's assumptions about you having seen it were right. So that's kind of how that gets worked around. But yeah, so you're still kind of
And
confined.
I guess, and this is just because all of this is part of a much larger kind of point that I'm making, and it's a little nebulous. But because part of my issue with the progress is that you don't know which of these stories is important. You don't know if it's the story of Zampano that we're mostly looking at, if most of the action and progress is going to be Navidson, or if most of the progress is going to be Johnny. And
So can I get a little
even
bit abstract?
within, Mhm.
I think that almost puts us on more of a level playing field with the characters themselves, because in our stories where we're characters, you never really know in real time which chapters are going to be important. You never know when you
Yeah.
wake up what sort of days are going to end up changing your lives, and
Mhm.
so you're taking it at face value in real time, and you're kind of aware that something's going to happen and something's going to be important, but you're kind of right there with them in that it's it's stalking you. And
Yeah. And that's what I mean by that I do admire the structure, because there is that structural uncertainty that is being built in. That the point of doing an epistolary or really any piece of writing is to communicate a certain feeling.
mhm.
And the feeling that seems to be communicated is chaos and a lack of trust in reality,
Okay.
because there's the full possibility within this universe, and I very much mean within the internal logic of this universe. It's possible that everyone is real. It's possible that none of them exist.
And a dozen possibilities sort of in between.
Oh yeah, there's a
Um,
thousand little
I think
permutations of that are possible.
I think that fleshes itself out to an extent as we go, but there's never a M. Night Shyamalan sort of big reveal moment. When I remember my experience. I got to the end of it and I said, I don't buy the story at face value how it was presented. I think some of this is real and some of this isn't, and I can kind of see a cycle, and I don't really know which direction it goes of kind of what's making what up.
Mm.
Um, I feel like I remember coming up with an answer that I was satisfied with and then subsequently forgetting it, so we're all gonna piece it back together, I guess. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, I think your statement of distrust in reality is given to the reader explicitly with the Pit Boxer story, where
yes.
you now have to distrust the reality of the book you are reading. How much is made up from,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was
Just
one of.
the that he is a storyteller, that he has a natural ability to kind of weave tales.
So that was one of the questions that I kind of put in the little question box that we decided to do in advance so that we can think about questions. So I had pointed out two different examples where Johnny sort of blatantly admits to this is not what the text was, or this is not what the text should be, but it is, and you can deal with that. Um, and one seems very disloyal to the text and Zampano's intentions, and one seems almost loyal to Zampano's intentions to a fault. And it's sort of together, what do we take away from those as a whole about Johnny's character, his intentions as a curator of this text and as an editor of it, and sort of how much kind of do we trust what he's presenting to us after these two things together?
I think at least my experience is definitely the lack of reliability as part of it. And when you asked that, it made me think about the chronology of it,
Okay.
because one of the times that you tend to see people having inconsistencies in editing is when they've been working on a piece, something happens, and they go back to working on it.
Okay.
And an experience that has somehow changed them or has slowly changed them over time changes the way that they even interact with the text. Because when you look at the introduction, and introductions are usually written, oddly enough, once you're
Done
done,
with everything else. And
but it's completely
chronologically,
unhinged and it sounds completely different from a lot of his other writing, but there are other footnotes that sound equally unhinged. And so it does give me the impression that Johnny may have gone in and really done footnotes completely out of order.
I think that's supported by the text. So I showed y'all that I found a podcast that I wish that it was complete. He does a really good job where he kind of goes page by page, which is an ambitious project to begin with. He got like 100 and some odd pages in, and then he's been inactive for a year and a half. But so when I first started to listen to him, he had said, yeah, so the introduction is chronologically the last thing that Johnny writes. That's almost true. For the
Mm.
time being, you can assume, yes, he wrote the introduction after everything else. Be aware, towards and almost at the end, there is one thing that's afterwards that isn't necessarily important, but you'll be confused until you see the dates. That, oh, okay, I thought that the introduction was last. No, this is actually after the introduction. That kind of solves some false confusion there. But um, so yes, no, that's all I really meant to say with that is that the introduction kind of you can assume was written after the rest of what you're seeing. Um, but that yeah, you're right. The footnotes may not also be written chronologically in the order that they appear in either. That's fair. Which some of the footnotes kind of have directly to do with okay, he said this, I think that this means this, or this is what I think about this, or this is who I found to tell me about this. Some of them kind of step further outside, and like today I'm having a panic attack in the tattoo shop. Um, and it's because I stayed up with this text. Um, and having that context of, okay, did he put the footnote about the panic attack in the tattoo shop during this piece of text because that's what he was reading, or like is this just here? Eh,
I'm pretty sure he said this was the part that he was reading that made him caused him to have the panic attack.
That's right, because it was right after the Heidegger stuff that he was like, it's weird that I understood that because I read the German part and I wasn't affected, and then I found the translation and now I've got this phrase stuck in my. That's right, I remember that. Thank you.
Yeah. Martin Heidegger is definitely the kind of person who can give you a panic attack.
Yeah, I was mad at myself because like this is so for the first like 2/3 of the book, this will be the third time that I've gone through it. I failed to get done with it on my first read through, but then it sat for so long that I couldn't just jump back in. So for most of this is the third time that I've gone through it, plus the page by page podcast. That's why I made the comment last night. I was like, I've got to read the Pit Boxer story for the fourth time. Like, let's just get this over with. Um, but yeah, so this is like the third or fourth time that I've gotten to this point, and this is kind of the first time that I was like, I, I can loosely track with this Heidegger text, and I don't know what that says about me, but um, I didn't like that. I need to invest in a bookmark or some little tabs, some little sticky tabs, because I've got notes all over the place, and it's not, it's unwieldy to kind of be doing this like I am. Did anybody? I don't really know how to do this or structure this or organize this. I haven't really led anything like this before, and we're doing our best. Um, so yeah, chronology was important. Um, and that was one of the things that I was starting to keep track of. Just anything that referred to a date or a pin in that timeline. So you've got even some inconsistency there I found because when Johnny is telling the story of when Lude called him to be like, "Hey, get over here, this dude's dead, come check this shit out." On page 12 at the beginning of the introduction, about a third of the way down the start of the first incomplete paragraph, he says, "It was the end of '96. But then like 2 pages, 4 pages, whatever down on page 19, so a little bit more. He calls out this note that he found that was one day before Zampano died that's dated January 5th in 97. So he's close. He's not far off. It was the end of 96. And what he's referring to there was when Lude called him after Zampano died. But then he very directly calls out that it was actually early 97. I thought that was interesting. Um, Something that I admit I stole from. Was somebody saying something? Okay, so I'm just echoing. Sorry. Something I admit I didn't know, and I stole from the podcast. Um, so on page 6, not introduction 6, 6 of Zampano's text. Um, I guess footnote 8. Since the opening 3 years ago last April, which Johnny clarifies was 1993, was when the film came out. Um, and it's mentioned. So yeah, 3 years after we started to see the 5.5 minute hallway, the was when the Navidson record through was released through Miramax, and that's saying that that was in April of 1993. And just an interesting kind of piece of history there is that 2 months after, like in real life, 2 months after that, in June of 1993, was when Miramax was actually acquired by Disney, and so the placement of that date of the release of the film kind of seems to be implying that this thing made a big splash, kind of
Mm.
built a name for Miramax, and generated interest that led to that acquisition is kind of the sort of implicit, unmentioned history there, um, which doesn't matter, but I thought it was kind of cool. Most of my notes are kind of like that. That this doesn't matter, but I thought it was kind of cool. So if anybody has anything productive to say, please, because I will just bounce around otherwise.
So kind of bouncing around, but in chapter 2, it sent me to Appendix 2A to allegedly look at a floor plan, but I have no idea. Like, none of these look like any type of
Yeah,
A, coherence, but B, none of them look like a floor plan.
I remember thinking that the first couple of times. There was a small bit that kind of caught my eye this time, and that's on page 568 if all of our printings are the same.
568's the
Oh yeah, the
title.
start of the. So actually, a few pages in on 571, the upper card on that, it calls out the 1/4 inch, and you at least sort of have some schematic-y looking type stuff, and I think that's what that's talking about. It's not particularly detailed. I
Yeah.
think that's what that's talking about. Um, but I think the fact that that calls you to that appendix at that point in the story, and then the thing that it's talking about isn't even the first thing there. It's just kind of getting you to look at these weird stairs and this kind of light thing hanging from something, and I think it's just sort of taking an excuse to sort of put these images in your head a little bit early to kind of get you primed for what am I getting into. I think that was just a little bit self-indulgent on the placement there. Um, but yeah, no, I think that top card on 571, I think is what that's talking about. That doesn't add anything. There's no real reason to send you there other than I think just to kind of fuck with you, which I respect. Um, how recently did everybody get their copies of the books? I know we just started to organize this thing pretty. I know Maura, you like literally just got yours. Um,
Yeah, I just got mine. I read all of it about last night and the night before.
all of
So
this chunk that
I
we're
read
doing.
yes.
Okay.
I read the intro
You-
like 2 nights ago. And then
I
I
say you
read
just held up the
all
book. You were like,
700
I read
pages.
all of it, and I was like, oh well, fuck.
Oh no, I just read the intro.
Okay.
And then I read the 40 pages.
Okay. I read all of it. What?
And then I
Um, so I know I sort of halfway started a conversation about the copyright pages last weekend and then got scatterbrained. Um, so does everybody else other than me, um, where it says it's the first edition and that's struck through, you all had that in yellow, not purple, right?
what page?
Or, the copyright page right before the table of contents, right after the two-page spread title page.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yarg.
Nobody has purple. Okay. So directly underneath that, there should be either a number or a string of numbers. Somewhere in the low 40s, maybe? What does
I have
everyone have?
45.
45.
45.
All right, so everyone's got
Everyone
45
else
but
has,
you.
okay. So that number under there is, I think, what they call the printing key, and that's essentially to keep track of like the runs. Um, so it's the first edition, and that doesn't change until a sufficiently significant amount of the context or the contents, the insides, the words, the shit changes. That's all the same, so it's still the first edition. But then, they'll print it in batches according to sales or however that works. And if Melinda was here, she might know more about this than me. Apparently, at the start, they would print 8 to 10 of those in a row, and that kind of goes back to old how things were printed, that it was cheaper to take a block out or just grind the numbers off as you go, and then by the time you get to the end of your 10th run, hopefully you made enough money, you can make a new plate to print the whole page again instead of having to change it every time you print a new batch. So the podcast dude had, I think, the 33rd run, and that still had the row. So if you had more than one number on that row, you go by the lowest one that you have because they grind them off as they go. So he had number 33, but his still went 33 to 39 or 40. And so it still had those things. At some point, they've started doing only one batch at a time, which is interesting because mine is 41. And I thought, okay, that's just the end of, that's the last printing batch in the run. They've grinded everything else off. And 42 should say, like, 42 through 50 or something. But it doesn't because you will have 45 and it's also just 45. And it's, again, it doesn't matter. But so we know that at some point between 41 and the 45th printing is when these colors changed. Because I've still got the purple, and then we actually, if you want to come over here, we can compare. The Even the blue of House is like significantly different. Mine's a lot darker. So like I don't know how well you can see that. It's kind of almost like a cobalt, like a Lowe's brand type of blue. And then this is probably what y'all have. That's more of like a sky blue, baby blue type of. Doesn't matter. I don't know why I spent 5 minutes on that, but things change over time, and it's fluid, and it's mainly the small things like that. But it's just kind of interesting to compare what people are dealing with. Um, Again, if anybody else has something to comment on it, otherwise I'm just gonna start flipping through my notes and making dumb
I
comments.
guess since this is our first impressions, really, and since this is our first exposure to the book,
Mhm.
some of the a first impression conversation is probably
Yeah, that would.
good. And for me, my immediate impression was how much it reminded me of other pieces of modern horror.
Okay.
And it's had me kind of thinking about like what I like to call in my head like the genealogy of horror, because I'm sure that this was drawing upon past pieces, and I've seen similar themes in more modern pieces, like the podcast that I posted, and I think you listened to it. I know you said you didn't like it. I don't know why you didn't like it. You didn't say,
that.
but it's such a similar concept, and I think that exploration of these kinds of concepts is interesting. Just our lack of comfort with even these minor changes in our environment that eventually snowball into larger changes, of course. And I have some of my own thoughts on this question, but I would like to open up the floor for conversation on this one. What do you think is making modern horror lean more towards psychological explorations rather than creature features and hauntings and mythology?
More. So more. I see your face. You've got thoughts. You go.
Yeah, so I really love horror films. And I think one of the reasons why just like horror literature and horror films in general are like moving toward more of a psychological thing is because you have to sit with it and face the fact that like you like these characters, you too have like a being and a brain and a train of thought, and a lot of these things like you have to sit with. And they're much scarier than, say, like a creature feature or something
Yeah.
that you can say, okay, that's not necessarily real. I can distinguish reality from that. When,
Mhm.
say, it's like, I guess a good example would be like, I mean, Hereditary with by Ari Aster had like a lot of things going on in it, but it was also a lot about like familial trauma. And that hits close to home to like a lot of people,
Mhm.
and like what goes on in your head while those traumatic things happen is very familiar to others. And I feel like it strikes people differently.
Okay.
Um, my thought of why such psychological horror is becoming more popular is because we are already more alienated from our lives than ever. The alienation of labor and alienation from leisure time, and a lot of psychological horror takes that to the extremes and kind of acknowledges that alienation is real and
Hmm.
scary. And I think a lot of people somewhat resonate with that.
Okay.
But I do also agree with what Morris says is uh, psychological horror can also delve deeper into those heavy themes such as familial trauma rather than just having man with knife and a William Shatner mask.
That was horrifying, though.
So I
Yeah.
can't. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You haven't talked this whole time.
Oh,
You're
gosh
going.
darn it. No, I want to echo all that. It's also interesting, like you said, like, I don't know, the 50s, considering like creature features of like the 50s, like it was this era of like feel good and like, I don't know, interest in science, interest in aliens and stuff. And like now, to echo, like now it's alienation. Now it's, being by yourself. Now it's like your inner demons, being a lot scarier than aliens. Maybe we've gotten too smart for creature features.
I think there are still ways to make creature features engaging and somewhat scary. Like
I agree.
one of the podcasts I really like is Old Gods of Appalachia, and
Yeah.
it's a horror anthology, but not really psychological. It has clearly defined villains.
That's fair.
So I'm gonna kind of flip it on its head a bit, and I can't support this. I'm pulling this out of my ass. So if you have something to
Oh,
support me
please do.
being wrong, please put me in my place. But I almost think that the psychological theme as a contrast to the creature feature man with knife and a mask might be a little bit of a false dichotomy. I think that it's always been psychological, and these things have always been sort of external reflections of broader cultural fears. I think we're just getting better at it and better at saying it in ways that
Mm.
don't need to hide behind the sort of allegorical type of things, and you can kind of call it out for what it. I think horror has always kind of been about those psychological fears. I think that it's becoming more overtly about that just because the field is getting more sophisticated and more effective at telling what it means to tell. But I don't think that that's new in and of itself.
No, I think you are correct because like the Twilight Zone does delve a lot into
That's fair.
the
Yeah,
psychological,
that's really good.
but I mean it does also have those creature featurey things like
Wouldn't that just be fucked up?
like the gremlins on a plane harassing William Shatner again.
I hate that episode. It's always Shatner, isn't it?
I like the
one,
one
yeah,
about the dude that works in a bank and he just wants everybody to shut the fuck up so he can just read his goddamn book and like he gets sick of everybody and so he like locks himself in the bank vault over his lunch break and he sits to read his book and while he's in the vault of the bank like a nuclear bomb goes off and like destroys the entire town and country around him and he's like the only one that survived because he was in this bank vault and that's definitely how that works and like he comes out and he sees that like the world is gone and he's like well damn. Anyway, I got my book. I'm gonna sit and read. Finally, they shut the fuck up, and he sits down and breaks his glass.
Yeah. Completely tragic. I forgot about that episode until this moment. Thank you.
That's always been my favorite my favorite Twilight Zone episode because there's no. It's just like that would suck. I'm gonna go top off my drink or just get another drink. Y'all don't kill each other.
wasn't planning on it.
That was threatening.
But I'm glad that I was able to get some opinions because even though it's not something that I'm explicitly like interested in, it's something that I've noticed enough of that we do have things that are purely psychological horrors like this popping up a lot more often that kind of are delving into this collective human experience. And I think a good counterpoint, like balance to it, is when you look back in like early to mid 2000s when things like Saw and whatnot were really taking off. And that's all like, I don't know how psychological you can really say that is, maybe a little bit,
Well, that's the same era
but
that this is from too.
I was not expecting.
Sorry.
I wasn't expecting that. But yeah, I just find it's interesting, and because there is a very good argument for how horror operates as exploring parts of the human psyche that we don't want to. And I mean, you can, like, if you want to learn about that, like, pick up John Truby the anatomy of story because he will pick it apart and throw it at you, and you will hate the idea of writing after that.
Can you put that in
Um,
the notes and resources channel?
I think it's actually a scarier book than House of Leaves, so
Yeah, no, good.
yes, I will just throw it in off topic, but
No,
that
up
there
in
are distinct pieces that kind of
there's yeah.
correspond to
Anyway,
how
sorry.
we tell a story, and they can really be seen very clearly in horror, but you can also see how, based on different storytelling types that we've used over the years, there's definitely cultural forces that affect how we tell stories, just as those stories are then affecting us.
I'm sorry. Can you say that last part again?
I just find it interesting that there are these aspects of stories that you can track throughout history, changing as culture changes, just as stories do affect us. It's this nice little coexistence of us affecting one another, while one still only really exists within us. One of those dichotomy of self things. It's kind of bizarre and would require maybe too much background info, but it's fun, and I like
It is.
thinking about it. So
All right. It's been almost an hour, which is nifty. It doesn't feel like it. So I guess. Oh, did somebody?
that was just
Oh, that was
me
you. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
posting the name of
Yeah.
the book. If
Yep.
people want it,
So
if you don't, that's
I'm
cool.
not going to read you all of the notes that I made because I made a lot, and most of them are either repetitive or not super impactful. But I'm going to flip through and kind of see if anything stands out. Um, I did like the sort of like film noir type of tone that Johnny takes in the introduction. Um, the paramedics said there was nothing unusual, just the way it goes. 80 some years and the inevitable kerplunk. The system goes down, the lights blink out, and there you have it. Another body on the floor surrounded by things that don't mean much to anyone except the one who can't take any of it along. Still, yeah, like it was just like okay, like um, what's the guy? I would think Jawline when I think of him. Um, not important.
It's funny though because I was just starting to read Black Wings Has My Angel, which is like the prototypical crime noir kind of thing. And like I read this and I was like, oh wow, this is surprisingly a similar tone.
um, we got that like sort of doomed author, sort of forbidden knowledge theme with the. I should have turned around right then. I should have known something was up at the very least, since the consequence in the air. Blah 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 blah. And he goes on for like a half a page up to like
A typo might have been a better word.
uh so okay, I referred forward. So on page 21, he's talking about and probably has everything to do with the fact that when I was 10, my father died. And almost 9 years later, my crazy Shakespearean mother had followed him. Was the way that he describes his mom, and I had actually made the comment during the introduction that he had a passage that I sort of described as seeming oddly Shakespearean just in tone. Um, endless snarls of words, sometimes twisting into meaning, sometimes into nothing at all, frequently breaking apart, always branching off into, he goes on and then after saying all this, and just the lists and the sort of pattern of it, just and then it gets to but find your own words. I have no more, or plenty more, but why? And all to tell what? Like it was just like that seems weirdly Shakespearean. I mean, then he uses that same word to describe his mother. Did anybody? Okay, I hope somebody else knows this and can tell the story, because I don't want to. So the page between the introduction and the Davidson record that just says says Musa's sign. Was that familiar to anybody? Yes, you know it. You know it. Go do it.
Yes. It kind of reminded me of the phrase mise en scène, which is just like a French word for like what is in an image that a lot of like cinematographers use for like, okay, what is
Mise en
composing the
scene.
image? Like, yeah.
That's not the connection I
So
made,
that
but it does sound familiar. And the fact that it's about a
yeah,
film.
it sounded
I just know that it's Beethoven, but that's
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. So he wrote it in the margins of like one of the last string quartets that he wrote. It was some rich dude had commissioned to write this quartet right before he died, and he kind of knew that like, he's old and he's sick and he's dying. And it took him forever to write this thing. Um, and like the client was like, "I paid you money. You're about to die. Like, where's my shit? Like, just I don't care what you write. I just want it to come from you. I just want to be able to like just write the thing." And he's being all melodramatic, and he's like, and it might have come from the awareness that it's one of the last things he's going to write. And he's laboring over every, and I don't know enough to, but um, but it's and so at the end, he writes "Musa sign es muss sein." Must it be? It must be with an exclamation point. And it's just sort of the indecision. What did I write? Indecision and inevitability in the face of finality. It's the gravity that's given to the small decisions that even though they've always been just as important, it's the awareness of that importance sort of closing in on you as you don't have many of those decisions left. And it's just this sort of terrible weight of it and just with the inescapability of, and kind of in the same way, like Zampano spent at least the last, what, oh wow, the film wasn't even out that long. He did this in 4 years, but he didn't get done with it. Is the thing is he called it his labor of love or something, but he was obsessed with it and always editing and dictating and revising and perfecting and never finished it. Beethoven got his shit done before he died. At least you can give him that much. Zampano did not. Um, so I just thought that was a cool like I missed the weight behind that until the podcast told me, and I thought it was worth chewing on.
Something else I kind of that hit me was on page 35, uh, imperceivable and alone, though not I think so lonely.
Mm,
Uh, that is until he closes his eyes, and then
yeah,
just
What page was this?
interesting. 35. Yeah, the last paragraph on 35.
Hmm.
yeah. That's when she asked if he had kids. Um, he said he didn't have any children anymore. Then he added, "Of course, you're all my children," which was strange since I was the only one there.
It does seem odd to me that this obsession seems to be transferable and infectious, and not just within the object itself, but within any hearing about it. Because it doesn't seem like Amber had any major exposure to the notes, but heard enough about it from Zampano to
I think she
kind of
was.
inherit this obsession.
I think she was more obsessed, and that might be a strong word. I think she was more interested in Zampano himself than his work. She doesn't really say anything about the house or about Davidson. She talks about Zampano and his eyes and his what it was like to be in the room with him is what stuck with her. And
But they did talk about how Lude eventually had to leave the conversation because he didn't have enough
That's right. That's
specifics.
right. That's right. You're right.
Which I don't know if that's really an important thing. If it comes back to be important, time may tell. But like, it just was. It's interesting how obsession, or, and I guess I do want to use the word obsession, can be transferable between people, and even in a completely non-supernatural sense,
Yeah. Just
that it
the
can operate as an infectious disease of sorts.
so the one note that I made on that page, and Eden, this might stand out to you more than, but I had underlined the part right at the end of the page where it was like that tiny place of his was suddenly full of faces, and he could see them all. And the note that I just made, because I'm a sentimental piece of shit, was full of faces. I just made silent in the trees, and because I'm sorry, because there's such a rich imagery that I never saw it externally. This doesn't come from anything, but every time I think about that scene of standing there silent in the trees, there's this fog and there's this mist and there's these people in my life or not in my life, and that's the point, but people from my life, from my past, are just sort of beyond the point where that mist is too thick to see past anymore. And it's kind of the same as like being in that room and your eyes just sort of glaze over and they're not there with you, but they so inescapably are, and they always will be, and there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, um,
If I could, I would like to take a moment to highlight just what brought us to this passage of the uh, imperceivable and alone, though not, I think, so lonely. Because I do think that's an important thing to keep in mind about Zampano, whether it's because of this interacting with others that he even had towards the end, because Johnny kind of indicates that he lost contact with other people, but it seems that their projects are at least similar in some regards, but Zampano had a completely different experience than what it seems Johnny did, because Johnny seems to have slowly lost it and been overcome with almost malevolent force,
well,
where Zampano seems to be a little more lucid and calm.
I mean, his vents were sealed with duct tape and caulked shut, and he wound up
Yeah.
dead on the floor with his mysterious claw marks. I mean, that's about as malevolent of a force as I can conjure up.
But he was still interacting with people in a vaguely normal way, where it kind of seems like Johnny is saying that he stopped interacting with people,
That's fair.
where Zampano just kind of,
I,
even though he was privately like being a maniac like all of us, that when he was out and about doing his walks, talking to people, being read to, like he was kind of still with it.
and
Enough that nobody felt the need to explore his
right.
place.
That might just be an age thing too. It just kind of comes with
Maybe.
experience. Um, yeah.
So I do uh on page 36 she did go uh I guess I take back what I said before, because with his eyes closed he didn't look alone, then he looked lonely, terribly lonely, and that made me feel real sad and it made me feel real lonely too. I stopped going there after a while, but you know what, not visiting him made me feel guilty. I think I still feel guilty about just dropping out on him like that. So I don't know exactly what that says, but
It's almost just to kind of, I think, to reinforce like the unreliability of everybody who's been in contact with Zampano, that even she doesn't seem to have a coherent train of thought when it comes to him. Which, if that's not the point, I at least
Yeah,
find it
I think
interesting.
it's the contrast too of like that facade of he seemed alone but not lonely when he's interacting with her, but then he closes his eyes and that's kind of when that facade falls, and it's like those moments when we are alone with ourselves, whether it's for a fraction of a second or kind of staring at the ceiling for hours on end at night. Like it's easier to kind of convince other people that we're where we want to be than maybe it is to convince ourselves. Yeah.
It's
Um,
interesting. Very
oh,
interesting.
okay. So one thing that does connect to something else that there maybe should have been a footnote to point you here because it's not a spoiler and it never really comes up again, and it's not particularly valuable, but it's just one of those things that like I got to the end of the main text and I'm starting to read through everything in the appendices that I didn't get pointed to, and I found something that like has a very one-to-one relationship with in the footnote on page 31, Johnny's talking about the things kind of that came out of Zampano's apartment and the way that they're all kind of gone. And the only thing that's left of the old man is this text, and that's why he feels compelled to sort of stay loyal to his mistakes and his errors and his actions because it's all that's left of him. Anyway, he talks about the battered shotgun bearing the initials RLB under his bed. Never mentioned again. Um, so if you look at Zampano's Appendix D, page 553, he's written a letter to an editor of a newspaper.
Okay, 554 is the letter.
Okay. And it's just that some schmuck was trying to sell these antique shotguns, saying that they were World War II models of a specific type. And Zampania wrote in an editor calling him out because the type that he's advertising has all these distinctive markings, one of which is the letters RLB are on the side of the gun, on the left side of the receiver. You can kind of take the time to read that thing, but that kind of hints that okay, that gun is under his bed. That gives you background into his character. That's a gun used in World War II. He's the right age. Like he probably served, and that's just something that you don't get pointed to explicitly, and that's something that I kind of wish that I had found sooner than I did. So
Mm. I often feel like this book is. I feel like I'm being handed a whole pile of Chekhov's guns, where it's just like, these might be important, have fun. And I'm like digging through, like, okay, well, which one of these is going to be the murder weapon?
it's a mystery tool for us to use later.
Oh, which is a good thing. I think it's fun. It kind of gives that trying to solve the case feel, but it is also like I totally understand how like little things like that shotgun just get lost.
Just completely just drowned out
Yeah.
in the noise.
I think is kind of what it wants you to feel like, and like
Hmm.
the the secondary cover that the that the official House of Leaf cover doesn't quite well cover over of just a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, and it's neat to get to the end and see how much of this I understand or comes in handy and how much doesn't. I mean, we've already gotten the tape measures are things that Johnny has sort of nailed to his walls, and we've kind of found out why because walls don't necessarily stay as static as they should. You got the sleeping pills. Um,
do want to ask, and this is just a request, like you can totally ignore me
Okay.
in all of this, but one question that, and because we can't answer it yet, but already has me curious. I'm curious about the purpose of each each perspective on this, because Navidson filmed it for a reason, and I mean they said like, oh, he was trying to film blah 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 thing about his family moving, but he kept filming. Zampano just wrote, and Johnny is writing. And one thing that kind of exists, even if like, even when we go ahead and we try to write something that is just like, I'm just analyzing what's happening here, there's always a purpose that kind of exists within it. And I'm just interested to see what purpose each of them seems to be focused on, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And I think Navidson's going to be the easiest of them to kind of start pinpointing a purpose, and becoming a little more difficult after that. But
So
just
there's
because I would like to know everyone's thoughts on that. But that's just a request. You can ignore me.
no, I think it might actually kind of have less to do with each of those people and kind of more to do with the subject itself. Um, because, or at least something that all of those people have in common is that once shit started to go sideways, Davidson kept filming because he really couldn't stop. Once Zampano found it, he engaged with it. He kept chewing on it. He kept running because he really couldn't let it go. It grew, it spread, it took root. The same thing happened to Johnny. I read the book and I'm subjecting all of you to it. Like each kind of tier, like it latches on, and once kind of these things start happening and unraveling, like what something that all of them have in common because of who they are, whether it's something that kind of is more universally held in common, whether it's something external to do with these events or with this story, it's just something that I think becomes a compulsion.
And I think that that could totally be the case. Like it could be as simple as that. But when when people write, like typically even if they don't realize it, they have a purpose.
No, for sure.
And whether it's that I'm writing because I'm trying to make sense of something, or I'm trying to assert that my perspective or opinion is correct. And so it could be as simple as obsession and being just drawn to the topic. And that's totally fine if that's the case. I just get the feeling that there's probably something a little bit more there. And I could be wrong.
There's a few. I try to come up with like a turn of phrase and then nothing stuck. There's a few juicy bones that you're going to enjoy chewing on, and
Mm.
take that for what you will. Um, but no, there's a few pockets of bone marrow to suck out of it, and I'm done stretching this metaphor.
You're
But
really digging yourself a hole. Keep digging.
yeah, I'm digging a hole to bury the bone. That's
But yes, that's my one request.
yeah, no, I think there's a few pockets that I can anticipate will scratch that itch. There we go. I know we don't really have a set time. I know we're getting past an hour, and I feel like we're going over time. I need to wrap up. If we want to wrap up, we can. If we don't, we don't. But um, okay. So note to myself: in addition to making my little scribbles and underlined circles and notes in the book, I kind of need to structure them in a document elsewhere to kind of have. I've gone through it. These are the things that are worth pointing out. These are the things that aren't. And this is what I have to say about them because I'm just flipping through and um, um, no. Oh, okay. So the weird little math thing. page 21, the real estate agent is talking about as a Navison's real estate agent Alicia Rosenbaum eventually revealed, the house on Ash Tree Lane has had more than a few occupants, approximately 0.37 owners every year, most of whom were traumatized in some way, and considering the house was supposedly built in 1720. So I kind of sat and like did the math, and that comes out to a surprisingly round or almost round number. So these events took place in 1990. So from 1720, that's 270 years after the house was built, at 0.37 owners per year. That's 99.9 owners. It's almost exactly 100
A lot of people.
versions of this story that have happened. And the fact that it's just such a round number that like this is the 100th iteration of this happening, and it's the one that finally got recorded and escaped sort of the bounds of those walls, and is what we found. But the fact that that's not a round number when you look at it on the page, and it just happens to
Mm.
fall into place, though, I thought that was interesting. Um, the page before that, I just underlined the line, "We all create stories to protect ourselves." Just was an oof. How do we feel just about the length of the chunk that we bit off? Did we want more? Was that too much?
Pretty good amount.
Yeah, I agree.
It was what?
I think it was a pretty good amount.
Okay. So I was eyeballing the way that things fall for next week. Would we be okay, at least for the ones to do a little bit more than that, just because of the way things shake? Because so chapter 5, and I wish that the chapters were in the table of contents because they're just not. So obviously it starts at page 41 because we read the 40. And it goes to page 73. So it's pretty hefty. The chapter after it is like literally a page and a half of Zampano and like 3 pages of Johnny. It's nothing. But during chapter 5 is what I was talking about last week, where it points you to the appendix that is the collection of letters. And that in and of itself takes up technically 60 pages, but it's a bigger font, wider spacing. Is that going to show up at all?
There you go.
So that appendix I remember took me maybe an hour to read. So we're looking at 40 pages of chapter 5, 2 pages of chapter 6, which is about comparable to what we did this week. But then that also includes about an hour or so for the letters. Is that going to be too much for people? Or do we want to kind of save the letters and kind of come back to them on their own session? How do we want to do it?
I was going to suggest chapter 5 in letters.
Okay, yeah, I mean, 6 is, like I said, 2.5 pages, and it kind of seems like a neater stopping point. I mean, 6 isn't going to take but 2 minutes to read. Does that work for people?
It's
Yeah.
good.
Okay. Um,
So go through the end notes connected to chapter 6, or
yes, yep.
okay, cool. Dope,
So
dope, dope.
we are going to finish on, what is it, 70?
I think it's actually
Like 79 or
Yep,
page 80 is
yeah,
chapter 7, so go up to chapter 7 basically.
yep. So stop at the beginning of page 80, plus read Appendix 2D and E, which is the letters.
Cool.
So, I'll try to have my thoughts a little bit more organized next time because I feel like I was unstructured and I also feel like I had thoughts that I didn't get to. But thanks.
Glad
They're
to be
lovely.
here.
Yeah.
Great to be on the show.
uh, Long time listener, first time caller. Yeah. All right. So yeah, again, we'll continue to try for next week. If things come up, and we can digress from there. But um,
Cool.
thanks for happening. All right.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Talk to everyone later.
Mhm.